Hello my gorgeous friends, so I'm back again. This is the second part of the Rosemary and Fred West series that was requested by the lovely Jane. So in this part I am talking about their later crimes, their capture, and just the potential around what could have happened, what more could they have been involved in. So as is the case with the previous one, I do go into some detail around things that could be potentially triggering. So if anything around violence, sexual assault, etc. is in any way triggering for you, please just X out of the video, take care of yourself. But if you want to learn a little bit more about the case of Rosemary and Fred West, then this is the video for you. Do please keep on watching. Welcome back. So at this point we see that Rosemary and Fred have essentially gotten away with an horrific assault of Caroline Owens, but they had kind of learned at this point, hey, let's make sure that we don't get caught for this again. They were continuing to use their house as like a tenancy. Now they were having more and more kids, and now let's be super clear, they were not good parents. Like I said, there was a lot of assault. It was a whole thing. Now they had several tenants moving in, and one of them was Linda Goff. So Linda moved in with them, and it seems that she essentially got embroiled in some way in their whole situation, but it ended badly, and she was only 19 and she was killed in April of 1973. Now her mother actually ended up looking for her and came to the house, and Rosemary answered the door and she said, well, she's actually gone off to Weston-super-Mare, she's no longer staying here, you know, good luck finding her. But it was then that her mother noticed that Rosemary was wearing Linda's slippers, and when she went around the back of the house she saw that some of Linda's clothes were on the washing line. Now what had actually happened to Linda was she had gone through everything that poor Caroline had gone through, and she was dismembered and put underneath the floor of their bathroom, and apparently while doing that Fred managed to damage a pipe, which subsequently ended up impacting the entire plumbing of the house. So the kids used to stay in the cellar, so they would live there, and sometimes when there was a particularly bad rain they would actually have to get into like a plastic container and kind of like shimmy across the floor so as to not get wet, and they would pick each other up. Why did that flooding happen? Because Linda Goff was in the bathroom. So Fred and Rose only seemed to escalate their behaviour because they then came across Caroline Ann Cooper. Now she was only 15 at the time, and you know, they did the classic thing of what serial killers do of, you know, finding at-risk transient people, and she was 15 and she was living in a children's home, and they, you know, presumably picked her up at a bus stop, and she was only 15 at the time when they killed her in November of 1973. And again, the pattern was just escalating at this point. Lucy Partington was 21 when she went missing in December of 1973, and she was a university student, actually from a very, which was quite unusual for their victims, came from a very stable background. I believe she was like studying medicine or something like that, and her disappearance did trigger a lot of police involvement, so it's kind of surprising that they weren't found at that particular point. But again, she was actually buried in the cellar along with Caroline Ann Cooper. Then in 1974, a Dutch student, Trace Siegenthaler, had come to the UK, and she was actually kind of bypassing or going through the UK to get to Ireland. That was where she was planning on going, and unfortunately along the way she met the Wests, and the same fate befell her, and she was murdered in Easter of 1974. So we can see there was about four kills within less than a year. This is like a pretty big escalation. There was clearly quite a bit of an appetite for it. They were really going for it. Now, the next one that we have then is Juanita Mott, and she was a lodger, and she again went missing. Now, she had two sisters who were looking for her, and they actually came to the house, and again they were fobbed off and told, well, she's actually just moved on. But her sisters found it really weird that she never got in contact with them, because they said no matter what, she would have never done that. We meant so much to her. There is no way that she would just leave. So they were left in this horrible state of just like not knowing what had happened to their sister. But the horrible thing was that they were standing there in Rose and Fred's house asking where their sister had gone. They were just feet away from where their sister was buried. And she was actually, again, placed down in the cellar. So like I said, the cellar was actually, it started off as a playroom for the kids, but eventually it was kind of converted into where like some of the kids would actually sleep as well. So like it's so weird, and it's so creepy that they did all of that. And like I said, this was not an idyllic home. They weren't like good to the rest of the kids. It wasn't like they were being super nice. So each of the kids were essentially going through their own horrible experiences. Stephen, one of the boys, was tied to a toilet seat and just repeatedly beaten by Rose. And this was because I think Rose had thought that he had stolen something. Now, all through this time, Rose was actually operating as a prostitute, and it seems that Fred was kind of egging her on, and he had like walkie-talkies and cameras and stuff installed in this room where she would take clients. Now, and some of the kids she actually had, at least 3 of the 8 were not Fred's, that they were actually her clients, and one of her clients was actually her father. So that's just adds to the creepiness of it. And she actually had like Fred install a red light on her door so that people knew not to disturb her when she was with the client. And Anne-Marie, who was Fred's oldest, said that she has a memory of a client coming out of this room and seeing her and kind of saying, well, you know, can I have her? And that must have put the idea into their heads, like it's, or maybe they were going to do it anyways, who knows. They were pretty sick individuals. But Anne-Marie in an interview actually talks about how when she was very young, her father and Rose bring her down to the cellar and said, well, this is something, you know, every father does with their children, and they proceeded to, you know, sexually assault her. And this happened apparently on a regular basis, and she had to thank her father. And she was told, you know, oh, you're making a big issue out of this, it's not a big deal, you know, all dads do this, and it's only because I care for you, and this will make you a better mother, and all of these like totally screwed up things. And she was terrified, of course, like who wouldn't be? And by 1977, along with all of these repeated assaults, she was now being forced into prostitution in, well, what we're going to call was her home, if you can even call it that. So poor Anne-Marie was going through all of this, and she had asked several times as well as to like, where's Charmaine? Where's my mum? Like, what happened there? And Fred said to her, oh, well, you know, your mum came and got Charmaine. And then, of course, Anne-Marie said, well, why didn't you take me too? And he said to her, well, you're the wrong colour. Because he had a big issue, you see, with Charmaine being part Pakistani, because he was like quite racist at the end of it, like it seems, as if that's the worst thing about him. Like there's so many bad things about both of them, let's be entirely real. So by 1977, poor Anne-Marie had like just gone through so much, and all of the kids had gone through so much. Like in 1 year there were about 35 hospital visits that like detailed things like STDs, vaginal tears, etc. So you do kind of think to yourself, why is nobody reporting this? Like it was pretty clear what it was that was happening. So thankfully, in 1977, Anne-Marie managed to get out. She left, much to the chagrin of her parents, but she kind of was like, okay, I'm getting out of here, I'm getting out of Dodge. Can you really blame her? Now, it seems that maybe that precipitated the next event. So shortly after this, in 1978, Fred and Rose actually killed another lodger. This was actually Shirley Robinson. Now, she had been a lodger with them for a while, and it seems she had actually entered into a romantic relationship with Fred, and she was actually pregnant with his child. And there's some that speculate that maybe it was that Rose got jealous of the whole thing and feared her as a threat, so basically ordered that she be killed. Whatever happened, she befell the same fate as the rest. However, she was the first to actually be placed outside the house, so she was actually put into the garden because they were running out of space in their house to put the bodies, which terrifying. It's a terrifying thing to think of. And again, you know, there were people looking for her. Her father was like wondering what happened to her. Like, again, it was really quite weird that she was pregnant and then just suddenly, you know, fell off the face of the earth. They left it for another year and they had one more kill, and this was Alison Chambers. Alison Chambers was only 16 when she was murdered in 1979, and again she was placed outside, and this time she was put under the patio. They were kind of put into a very strange situation. The only way that they could actually identify her was through her teeth, because of just, I mean, there was so many questions about who was actually found under that house. So at this point, Heather is Rose and Fred's eldest child, but she's going through an awful lot of trauma, and some of this was like coming out in school. She wouldn't shower at the school, and it, you know, she was like talking a little bit about Rose's occupation, and that did come back to Rose and Fred through some mutual friends, and they said, hey, just so you know, this is going about. So that may have actually been part of what precipitated what happened next. Now, Anne-Marie said that she feels a huge amount of guilt, which she shouldn't, like it wasn't her fault, but apparently Heather had actually come to her and asked could she stay with her, and Anne-Marie said no, because she figured that it would actually just bring more trouble onto Heather later on, and she was like, no, save yourself the trouble, don't come to me. But in 1987, then poor Heather was actually murdered. Now, in later police interviews, Fred actually said that he came home one day and he saw that Heather and two of the other kids were digging in the garden, and he turned to Rosemary and said, well, what are they doing? And Rose said, oh, they're filling in a hole, or not, they're filling in a hole, they're digging me a fish pond because I want a fish pond. And he was like, oh, okay, that's grand, what Rose wants, Rose gets. And he came back a few days later and it was filled in. He said, well, what happened? And she said, oh, I didn't want it anymore. And he said, oh, well, little did Heather know that she was digging her own grave. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily true, because again, so much of what he says is just absolute BS. Now, Heather had been trying to get out of the house, obviously. She had even applied to be a chalet cleaner in Torquay. Unfortunately, she got rejected for that particular job, but she was becoming a bit of a nuisance to them, so they killed her. And when people asked where she was, they said, oh, she actually got that job as a cleaner in Torquay. Unfortunately, throughout this time, the kids were still undergoing absolutely horrific abuse. Anne-Marie had brought it to the police before she had been afraid then to actually bring it any further, so it got dropped. And then following like in the early 90s, their child Louise actually ended up confiding in a person at school as to what it was that was happening, and social services were called and the children were removed. So this is where it all starts to unravel, right? Because a very apt detective called Hazel Savage, started to kind of look into things, because there was the horrific family joke of, if you don't behave, you're going to end up like Heather and be 2 down, 3 across under the patio, because they had it in like paving stones, sort of like a crossword. And that was the family joke. And Hazel basically did a family tree and tried to figure out, well, where is Heather? Where did she go? And she could not track her down. They looked into it, and like her social security number hadn't been used. She had no passport, so she couldn't have left the country unless she left illegally. So they're like, okay, what's going on? So this actually led to them kind of saying, okay, I think we actually have enough evidence here to look into this and start, you know, potentially going into the house and excavating. So it was in February of 1994 that the police called to the house and said, you know, we have a warrant here, we're gonna dig up the garden. And Rose rang Fred in a very, you know, panicked manner and said, Fred, they're coming, they're digging up the garden, you need to do something about this. So Fred actually came back and he went down to the police station, and he basically just spent his time kind of almost making fun of the police, kind of being like, oh my god, I can't believe that you believe what these kids are saying, like it's just a joke, like how are you so gullible that you would believe what kids are saying, like do you have nothing better to do? Like he just went down and like taunted them, which I just find really interesting that he decided that was the play that he was going to do. And he did actually get quite frightened then when he saw that they were digging, and he went and he actually admitted and said, yeah, okay, I did, I killed Heather. And they were like, oh, holy shit. And he said, oh, you know, Rose had nothing to do with it, she didn't even know about it, this was all me, she had nothing to do with it, she was innocent. I guess him trying to like protect her or something in his own, I suppose he probably thought that he was being like quite noble about this in his own way. And 3 days passed and nothing had been found, and he actually changed his story then. He said, oh, actually no, Heather is still alive, she's actually like a drug runner and she's over in Bahrain. Like, okay, I guess. So he was a bit all over the place, and he actually had to have like a social care worker, because they realized, well, he's illiterate. And actually when they looked at his IQ, he had an IQ of 80. And there's loads of studies, actually there was a really interesting study done by Melby recently, and they looked at people who had a borderline intellectual disability. So that's between 70 and 85. So he was just in there, and they're more likely to have like a lot of like mental health issues. So I thought that was quite interesting. But Janet Leach came in and she kind of chatted with him, and he then on day 3 was saying, oh no, this was all whatever. But their forensic pathologist at the time, Bernard Knight, was carefully excavating, because when you go in and excavate a site like that, you can't just bring a digger in, you're like literally going like shovel by shovel and like sifting through it. And he found a thigh bone, and then the police kind of came to Fred and said, well, we found this. And you know, he went back to say, okay, yeah, I did it, yeah, it was me, you know, I did it. And the plot thickens that a little bit more, and the forensic pathologist was going through it again, and he found another 2 thigh bones, and he turned to the officer who was in charge at the time, and he said, okay, well, either this girl Heather has 3 legs, or we have another body down here. So they went to Fred with that, and that's when he was like, okay, yeah, there are more. And he admitted, he started saying, okay, you know, I admit to the murder of Heather, of Linda Goff, of Shirley Robinson and others. And here they are. And he was so all over the place. And during this time, Rose had actually been remanded it to like a safe house. Now they were very clever. They had the safe house kind of bugged with cameras, and they kind of saw her behavior was really unusual. Like, she was saying that she was really angry with him, but they could kind of tell from her behavior that it was more that she was like kind of nervous that he was going to rat on her or say something. Now she needn't be worried, because he was basically taking all the blame and going, no, she's an angel, she wouldn't have done anything, this was all me. Please don't say that, you know, I did this, it'll kill her and she'll hate me and blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. I guess his way of like detaching himself from it was, he said that, you know, the spirits of the people he murdered were telling him, you know, where they were and that they wanted to be found. And they kind of went along with it, and they were like, oh, okay, buddy, you know, whatever you say. And he led them to where he had buried them. He actually even led them to where he had buried Anna McFall and Rena Costello. So Anna was the first person he murdered, but she was the very last person to actually be recovered. And he went to court. At this point, Rose had actually been captured as well. They figured out that she had something to do with it as well. And when they met in court, you know, he tried to reach out for Rosemary, but Rosemary was having absolutely none of it. She like looked visibly repulsed and kind of shunned him. And he totally changed his story then, and basically was like, yeah, no, Rosemary did this, Rosemary did that, and she was in on it too. But we can see from the case of Caroline Owens, she absolutely was in on it as well. But he was like really disheartened about it. And what's interesting was, he talked an awful lot about Anna McFall and how she was the love of his life and how she was an angel. Now, I don't think that was actually the case. I think it was that he viewed her in that way because she was his first kill, and he viewed her in such a positive mind, because a lot of serial killers, their first kill is their favourite and they just keep trying to recreate it. But he actually then said to the police who had him in custody, because he was in prison at this point, you know, like, oh, I'm going to be here for a while, you know, give me some things to do, because, you know, I need to keep myself occupied. Like, give me, you know, clothes or something to mend. And they were like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll do that. So they gave him clothes and stuff to mend, but he went through his like normal daily procedures on January 1st, 1995. But what he had actually been using all of that for was to construct a noose with which to hang himself, and he was found dead in his cell on January 1st, 1995. Now, this is of course incredibly frustrating to the victims and the victims' family, because they weren't able to have their day in court with him. Like, in no way was justice served, and there were some speculations that maybe the prison officers had something to do with it. Now, I personally don't think that's the case at all. I think the prison officers were very forthcoming and they had nothing to do with it, but it led to an awful lot of speculation. So at this point, Fred is dead, and it's starting to look like he's going to get all the blame for all the murders, you know, which obviously not ideal. But this is where forensic odontologist Dr. David Whitaker comes in, and he was able to figure out some very, very startling things. Now, they were kind of in this really awkward position, because basically Fred couldn't name all of his victims, so they had the killer but they didn't know who the victims were. So it was up to actually David Whitaker to identify a lot of them. So for instance, Alison Chambers, she was identified with dental records. Now, what they were trying to do to try and get Rose was kind of prove, well, she had something to do with it. Now, Caroline's testimony, she got back in and was like, hey, no, I'm gonna do this. And she said that kind of helped her feel a lot better after those years of survivor's guilt, which it's great to see that she was able to kind of move on and do that much out of it. But what David Whitaker did was, he was able to get a picture of Charmaine from about a month or so before she died. And what happened, it was a complete fluke. It seems to be that the defense team randomly faxed it to their office by mistake or something like that. It was really weird, like it happened by sheer chance. And he was able to show from the remains of Charmaine that her death would have happened in June when Fred was still in prison, so there was no way that he could do it. So they were able to get her on that, and they were able to get her on 10 of the other murders. They obviously couldn't get her on Anna McFall and Rena Costello. She had nothing to do with those, or so we think. And she was charged then and given 25 years in prison. So that was October 1995 when she was given 25 years in prison. Now 2 years later, the then Home Secretary, I believe his name was Jack Straw, said, no, we're changing that so that she's in there for life. She's not getting out. Like, that's that. Now, interestingly, in 1996, Fred's brother John actually ended up committing suicide because he was implicated in the rapes of Anne-Marie. So it seems he was trying to get out of that. Now, knowing that, it does kind of make you think back to the whole thing of Fred's childhood, and was there that link of abuse, etc.? Because, you know, having two members of the family involved in that is a bit, like, you know, does make you wonder. But you do think, you know, there's a huge amount of a mental health impact for the children from this. So Anne-Marie, for instance, I mean, she went through so much trauma and a huge amount of survivor's guilt. She actually attempted suicide, and so did Stephen in 2002. And their brother Barry West actually died at the age of 40 from an overdose. So the impact that it had on the family is massive. So that does kind of lead us to wonder, they had a combined body count of 12. But if we look at 1973 and 1974, there were about 4 or 5 murders there within a very brief amount of time. But there was nothing then between 1978 and 1987, which was when Heather was murdered. Now, we know that Fred actually worked as a builder, and his boss at the time said, hey, he was totally willing to go and even do a job on Christmas Day if I asked him. Now, if you're a builder, that means you have access to an awful lot of, you know, building sites and foundations, etc. I wouldn't be surprised if they continued. It seems very weird that there would be a 9-year gap between victims when they had had such an escalated pattern, and it's not like their cruelty, etc. had stopped. They hadn't. So it does kind of make me wonder, you know, are there bodies littered around Gloucester? And there were a lot of people who were very worried at the time they'd had Fred in as a builder, and they were like, do I have somebody under my patio? But the police couldn't investigate it because it didn't warrant it. They didn't have enough evidence on that sort of thing. There are, of course, still missing bodies, and we do have to wonder, what was he doing even up in Glasgow when he was there? Now, his son Stephen said that even when Fred was in prison at the time, he would talk an awful lot about his Glasgow connections, and they would talk about that, you know, in their childhood, and he would say it in a very dark and sinister way. Now, if you actually look at when he moved to Glasgow initially, he went to Coatbridge first, and at the time that he was living there were actually 2, let's call them notorious paedophiles at the time. There was the church elder, I think his name was James Galagi, and then there was the convicted child rapist, and they subsequently found out that he killed a kid, Alexander Garchaw, I think. Now, here's the interesting thing. Garchaw's daughter actually has confirmed that Alexander and Fred were friends, that they knew each other, that they were in each other's company, despite the fact that there were about 10 years in the difference. So were they potentially up to something then at the time? And actually, you know, Galagi, when he was on his deathbed in prison a couple of years after Fred had actually died, he said that there was a paedophile ring in Glasgow at the time in the 1960s that preyed upon vulnerable young girls, and that Fred West was a part of it. Now, I don't see why a dying man on his deathbed would bother lying about something like that, so it does kind of make you wonder. Now, another thing is that back in 1968, so remember that was the year that he actually killed Anna McFall, and it was the same time that he had actually met Rose, a lady called Mary Bassam, went missing. So she was 15 at the time. Now, she was actually working in a cafe that Fred used to frequent when he was working, like, I think it was as a lorry driver. So initially there wasn't really any real connection to there, but they did find that when they were going through articles removed from the West's home, that there was a locket that looked suspiciously like Mary's locket that she had actually worn as a bridesmaid to her brother's wedding. So her family are convinced that that's how she died, but they still don't have her body. Now, there is also like a list of about 5 women who went missing in Glasgow at the time that Fred was there. He could have had something to do with that. They never found bodies. And there are, of course, potential missing people in Gloucester that, you know, could have been their victims. But we can say that there are 12 confirmed, but I would personally be very surprised if there wasn't more. Now, this also brings us on to the question of, you know, who egged each other on? Would they have killed by themselves? And I think the answer is yes. Rosemary killed when Fred wasn't there. Fred was in prison and she killed Charmaine. And she was very much involved in that, and actually she told Fred to kill Caroline Owens, and Fred decided to let her go. And Fred had obviously killed before he met Rosemary. They were both going to kill without each other, but when they combined, they became this absolutely lethal force. So definitely something to consider. So that's it, that is the whole thing. Thank you so much for watching this video and sticking through the 2-part series. I just figured it was too long to put it all together. But I think it's an interesting story, I guess is the way to look at it. It's definitely, there's so many psychological variables that are at play there. The nature, the nurture, the physiological damage, the teratogens. I find it a very fascinating case, but also so incredibly harrowing as to the long-term impact that has had on an entire community. Thank you so much again for watching. I so appreciate it. This is the makeup look that I came up with. Lois, had to use your stuff. In case you're wondering, I used the shade Drinks in the lip liner and the lip gloss Toxic Manager. And if you want to know the various products I used, check out my Instagram. I'll have them all listed there under a picture of this nonsense. But if you liked this, then do please like, comment and subscribe. Turn on that notification bell so you can find more videos. If anybody has any other suggestions about who you would like me to research, it does take me a while, so bear with me, but put it down below and I'll see if I can do it. Do please share, because sharing is caring, unless of course it's an STD, in which case, you know, wrap it up. Don't be gross. But that's it. That's the end of the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.